Ah,
Oh my God, did it work?
yeah, I
Can you
see
see
your
me?
face.
Oh, I can see your face. This is an ordeal.
I feel like your face should be bigger, but like this is what we're gonna deal with.
We're gonna deal with this. Yeah, you have a fire in your background, which is very relaxing
Yeah,
to
the fire
watch.
is upstaging me right now.
This is, I feel like, just a metaphor for like every technological struggle. Like I turned 30 and immediately technology becomes impenetrable to me,
Yep. No, it's like
as is the way of the world.
I'm developing these like meaty hands that like can't manipulate the tiny buttons anymore. Um,
I had to Google, like everything used to be intuitive to me, and I had to Google, like, how do I request to join a TikTok?
and yet here we are.
We
Hi,
did it. Here we are.
hello. Um, I get to introduce you now. Hi.
Yes, that was all like the warm up, the preamble. Now here we
We're
are.
loose. We're
We're
loose. We're
going. We're
ready to
loose.
dissect some bodies.
Yeah,
Um,
and talk about historical misconceptions about women.
always. Which inevitably come back to the wandering uterus. Um, so hello. This seems good. We're just if this is also like an epic screw up that nobody can hear, then we'll enjoy it, I guess, and that'll be great.
It's like
Um,
we're just catching up face to face, like we're having our like a Zoom catch up.
yeah, exactly. I
Do you
should
remember
have.
like the early days of the pandemic when people were scheduling like Zoom happy hours?
Yeah, when Zoom was like we believed it could be fun. Um,
Yeah. Instead of somehow like it hacked like a part of your brain to be twice as draining as any normal social interaction.
yeah, because normally when I get together with my friends, I stare directly at their faces the entire time, and it's very relaxing.
Very relaxing, very comfortable. You're also staring at your face and hyper aware of what you're
Yeah.
doing.
No, I love that. I love to be trying to listen to someone tell me a story and thinking, like, why are my eyebrows so different from each other?
And I'm always thinking like, is this a listening face? Am I making a listening face? Do I look engaged?
we have we both have beautiful backdrops, so like this is how you manage it. If your face needs to take a break, people can look at the bookshelves behind you.
Yeah. I can look at the fire. Are you in Portland? Is this fireplace somewhere in Portland?
I wish. No, I'm in the Midwest still, where it's cold enough for. I have a non-working fireplace at my house normally that just has like books. Just it's all books. Um,
My my Portland based, well, or originating fiance has been trying to persuade me to move to Portland. I feel like passively since we started dating. And
mhm.
I was going to say, if this backdrop was Portland, it almost would have convinced me.
Oh, well, then it's Portland. This is Portland. You should come. Come live in Portland. I'm
Yeah.
in Port. That's this is Portland looks like that.
Yeah.
um, but let's. Oh my goodness, we have a book to discuss.
Yes, I have a copy of it.
Look at that. This is one of my favorite book cover designs in recent memory, and I feel like there's just kind of a lusciousness to it that brings everybody into the text and kind of prepares us for this journey through history that like is going to be gross and it's going to be scary and it's going to be beautiful. Um,
Thank you.
and
Yeah, I feel very lucky. I mean, as I'm sure you might know just from like being tangential to this world, like book covers are really like a hit or miss, and
mhm.
authors don't always get to choose. And like I got very lucky. It's like if people haven't seen it before, it's like an anatomical heart, but if you look close, it's also a lady.
Mhm.
Um, and what I like about it is I feel like young adult books often fit like certain aesthetic trends, and I think it nods to those trends, but also like I think some adults, lesser adults, are like insecure about wanting to read something that looks too YA,
Mhm.
that they'll be judged. And so I like that the book cover, I feel like, embraces both groups, like people who understand that like YA can be smart and fun and books about women are interesting, but also people who, don't necessarily gravitate towards like just like a woman in a dress looking away, things
Mhm.
that people stereotypically associate with YA.
And your title is Anatomy: A Love Story,
Yeah.
which just I don't know. There's something. I wonder how much restraint did it take to not call this like Resurrection Men or something.
I went through a lot of titles. Anatomy of Love Story was not the title. It was Rigor Mortis, a love story for a little bit. It was called The Necromance. It was called The Necromancer.
Oh, I love
The
that.
Necromance for like kind of fairly obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it just sort of landed on an Anatomy of Love Story because it hits all the marks without being off-putting.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like it maybe is it are you trying is there I mean, I was gonna ask, like, it seems like there's a balancing act to like draw in people who aren't necessarily gonna seek out a love story about, among other things, grave robbing and dissection, because some people are
Yeah.
self-reported into that, and I feel like maybe others, like once they're in a book where that's happening, they're like, all right, I'll keep going.
I kind of hope that this is now a segue. I have a podcast called Noble Blood where I talk about history, but I always try to talk about it in a way that like someone who doesn't like history would still enjoy it, or someone who says they don't like history because they were bored of history class would still enjoy it. And so I kind of wanted to write a book that like, even if you're someone who's like really put off by like something period piecey or like what you perceive period piece to be or something like, yeah, like gory or gross, that you still find a good, interesting story that's fun to read.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in case you're just joining us, it's Anatomy, a Love Story, which is the book that I wrote. And I'm talking to Sarah Marshall about it.
And you're Dana Schwartz, by the way.
Yes, I'm Dana Schwartz.
Yeah, and we have done, for people who don't know, like we've collaborated in the podcast sphere for a while now, and I have a podcast called You're Wrong About, and you are my royalty correspondent, which just makes me, I don't know, I'm happy whenever you come on, and I feel like I'm curious about how this book fits into kind of your broader goals as a historian, because I feel like, this history connects to so much of what you do.
It's very generous of you to call me a historian. I think I'm just more of an enthusiastic amateur. Like I just love history and like reading about it.
Mm-hmm.
And this book, it does not have the historical rigor of like a researched episode of my podcast or when I research for an episode of your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of freeing. I just got to like take the parts of history that I enjoy like learning about, where I'm like, oh, it's so fun to like imagine these dresses and like how gross it used to be in the 1800s, and then just craft a story around it. So when things from history were interesting, I included them. And then when I wanted to make things up, I did that too.
What did you make up? Like, because I feel like I was kind of trying to guess as I read through, and I find it very difficult, actually.
Thank you. I mean, I did really well. I did like research everything in terms of dates, and like I wanted all the technology to a certain point to be accurate. And if something is inaccurate, I wanted to explain it as like, oh, this is something that like a character specifically invented. Like anesthesia or something akin to anesthesia is invented by a character. That wouldn't be invented for another 30 years in history. But I think I sort of explained that away because it's like, well, a character's doing this. The main things that I sort of tweaked are Hazel's wardrobe. I sort of made a little more old-fashioned because in my mind also I wanted her house to feel very like trapped in the past, like sort of this like Miss Havisham, like her mom's in mourning. And like I wanted her house to feel very like, of a different world, and then she would be coming out to do all these modern things, where actually in history, like the Regency period dress for women it was modernizing. They were like comfortable empire waist dresses. And I'm like, well, that doesn't quite work for like the metaphor I'm trying to send. So I tweaked that. And then the only other thing that I was like, all right, I'm aware of it, but I'm overlooking it. When I put a bunch of diseases together and made something called Roman fever, which is an invented disease, but I think that is clearly invented. There's a thing in Edinburgh called the Princess Street Garden. That's the garden area in between Old Town and New Town. And at the time this book was written, you needed to be like a member and get a key to be able to get access to it. Like you needed to know someone who lived on that strip. It was like when, I don't know if Central Park was ever privatized, but it was a private park. And I didn't Hazel when my protagonist is like an upper class woman and like in theory she would have access to like knowing someone and getting a key and calling in a favor. But I didn't want to explain that. It just felt like unnecessary when the next year it would be open to the public.
Hmm.
So I was like, is that who's going to really care? And then, of course, I did get an email from someone who's like, or a Goodreads review that's like, how can I take this seriously when she talks about a park that wouldn't be open to the public for the next year? And I'm like, well, because it's a book.
I feel like if it's the kind of detail that, like, if you were remembering your own life, you might remember it wrong, feels
Yeah.
fair. It's like how in the movie of 50 Shades Darker, they're like, Anastasia lives in Seattle now. She used to live in Portland, and she's just done with Portland. It's fine. Forget it. We don't want to talk about her going back and forth.
Wait, the first 50 Shades is in Portland?
Well, I think she lives in Vancouver actually, but her life is basically in Portland. It's very, yet another vote in favor of Portland. It's the
These
town.
are, I will say on the record, I have seen all three of those movies. They came out in the time that I was a staff writer for Entertainment Weekly, and I think I wrote reviews of all of those movies.
Mm-hmm.
Better than I thought they would be. It's my verdict.
I mean, Dakota Johnson can do anything, and I'll be happy that she's doing it. That's my feeling about it.
I don't remember a single detail from the movies, but they happened.
They were there. We were there too.
Sarah,
And
I want to turn the tables a little bit on you and ask
yeah.
where do you start in terms of research when you're faced with a period or a subject that you don't know anything about?
I mean, I think probably I like to kind of start with the granular and the everyday life and then move outwards into a broader sense of what was going on. And I feel like this is something that we have in common in our work, that like what's interesting about history is like the texture of everyday life and like what did it smell like and what are people eating and what are they wearing and like how do what are the jobs and how much do you get paid and how much do things cost. And I mean, something I think of a lot because I used to do a lot of kind of early American literature is the Midwife's Tale by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who is one of the most misquoted people of the 20th century because she said, or she wrote, the line "well-behaved women rarely make history," and that's not like an encouragement. It's like that's just true. It's just that like if you're a woman and you show up in history, it's because you're like a serial killer or royalty or something.
Yeah.
And so A Midwife's Tale is based on the journal of a midwife in colonial Maine named Martha Ballard, which people had known about for a long time. It had always been around in the archives, but no male historian before her had managed to really find any information. And they had just been like, yeah, it's just like a record of what she got paid and where she went and what she did and who owes her money and who cares. And so the work of using this text is not discovering it, but like learning how to read it and learning how to understand how ordinary people are describing their lives kind of in between the lines. I think that's what I find
love that.
interesting.
That's so beautiful. Sometimes like I find myself when I'm researching an episode of Noble Blood, finding details that aren't pertinent to the actual thrust of the story, but things that I have to include anyway, just because they make the character seem so real. Like I'm doing an episode now on a princess, as it were, who is, negotiating her marriage as princesses do. And in like the books of her life, there's like pretty significant anxiety on her part because when she was 16, she had this like romantic relationship with a guy that probably was just romantic and not physical, but they exchanged letters. And now that she's like on the marriage market, she's really nervous that this guy still has her letters.
Wow.
And she's like, I burned all of your letters. You have to burn all of mine. And he's like, well, I'm at war. They're in a chest back home. But I told a friend if I die, just to not open that box and just put it at the bottom of the river. And and she's like, that's not good enough. You have to go, someone has to destroy that box. And just like the anxiety, it's like the way that people today would be anxious about like getting someone to delete their nudes or something. Like
right.
That like sense of vulnerability to another person when you're at a different phase in your life feels very like modern for someone who existed 250 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and this book is, I mean, it's so much about gender and about sort of like what throughout history, what areas of freedom exist, and how much more freedom does money or nobility potentially give you as a woman, and then also how much is it taking away from you. And for those just joining, we're talking about Anatomy, a Love Story with Dana Schwartz. Hello. But I mean, I'm curious too about just, I don't know, there's so much happening in this book. Well, one question I really am curious about too is like, it's about it's about gender, it is about class, and it's about class in a time of plague, because this is a
Yeah.
plague story. I mean, when did that element,
Oh
when did
yeah.
you
Well, the
come up with
wild
this?
thing is I pitched this book in 2019, like before the COVID thing
So you
happened.
knew what was coming.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
was deep in the ground. But plagues were interesting to me. I was inspired. I don't know if you know Jennifer Wright, who's another great writer who wrote this book called Get Well Soon, which is a book characterizing a bunch of different plagues throughout history.
Hmm.
And I think the fact that plagues are, in theory, an equalizer, right?
Hmm.
Like they affect everyone of different, in theory, but then
Mm-hmm.
again, society at different points in history has decided like who's worth basic standards of care and who isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was always kind of interesting to me to set this against a plague when original drafts of this book had like more of a sham medicine and more like snake oil salesman elements to it.
Hmm.
And I wanted to contrast like actual science and like the Enlightenment and the democratization of science with like people being left by the wayside. Like I think class and health are inherently linked. I mean, that's something you talk about a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as if history is, I don't know, we have so many costume dramas that I feel like we turn to for escape and for sort of getting away from today's troubles. And I feel like one of the things I appreciate about this book is that it's today's troubles, and they're Cuisinarted, and there's different outfits and sayings. But I mean, yeah, the concept of medicine being practiced very differently for the poor than for the rich, and having different goals for that matter. I mean, that feels, I don't know, was that always an element of the story, or kind of what came first for you?
That was really, even before I had a main character, I had someone like a wealthy, powerful man thinking, like the form of this changed, but like thinking, okay, well, the health of the wealthy elite is worth the suffering of, hundreds of thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was like, I think, one of the most important elements because I think class today exists, but people don't talk about it the same way they acknowledged it and understood it in,
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of years before. I think sort of like the myth of meritocracy has made us less willing to talk about like something that remains very much a fact of life, where it's like in the 1800s, people were literally like, I know exactly where I am in the class. It is articulate and discreet. Where it's like now in America, people seem that they just want to claim that everyone's equal, even when that the resources given to them that's absolutely not the case.
Right.
So I definitely wanted to talk about that because I think that's one of the interesting uses of history is pointing out like how much things haven't changed.
Right. Right. And that like new people keep being born, but we have the same psychology and we manifest it in different ways. And I mean, it strikes me that the way we behave about money and class in America now, it would be as if someone who's like a duke, 200 years ago would be like, if you work extra hard, you can become a duke, you can become noble, and you can have, an estate, a castle, or whatever, which nobody would have said back then. And it feels like equally cruel to be like, you will never rise above your station, you're just stuck where you are forever. But like, at least it's not lying, I think, and then
Yeah,
blaming
at
people for
least it's
not.
like gleefully honest.
Yeah. And well, something too, I was looking at kind of readers who were reviewing and recapping the book, and something that I love is that there were a lot of like GIF recaps. And one review I read that put in a lot of like Jack from Titanic GIFs to represent Jack in the book, and that
Yeah.
made me wonder, like, do you picture your characters while you're writing them? Like, do you see them in your head, or try and think like who would play them at all?
Yeah, this is so embarrassing because it's not even. If I was like Jack from Titanic, you'd be like, yes, like floppy hair, like,
Mm-hmm.
suspenders, scrappy, third class boy.
Right.
Like now in retrospect, I'm like, shit. I don't know if you're allowed to swear on TikTok. Now in retrospect, I'm like, shoot, I should have been picturing Jack from Titanic. I was picturing. Do you know they made a musical of the movie Heathers?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but yeah.
So for some reason, I would just been like in a YouTube rabbit hole of like the Heathers musical. And the guy who plays JD is just like in a trench coat and he's like pale and British and
Mm-hmm.
disheveled with like bags under his eyes. And for whatever reason, that's what I was thinking with Jack, even though Jack is way nicer than JD from Heathers. But just aesthetically, this like, the world's against me. I'm in a trench coat. But he's in the 1800s.
Yeah, it is like.
And
Go on.
I was sort of thinking of Hazel as like a mix between Elizabeth Bennett,
Mm-hmm.
rather, and Cher from Clueless.
I
Like
love that.
wealthy and entitled, but also really smart and competent.
Right. Yeah, and I think.
Someone in the comments, I just want to address this really
Yeah.
quickly, said, give us a coupon code.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I don't have that power. I wish I did. They take your book and they sell it. They buy it from you and now they're selling it. And no one tells me any coupon codes. I would give it to you if I had it. I promise.
If only we had that power. Yeah. Yeah, I love Cher from Clueless as an analog, because, like, I mean, it feels like there's a similar journey happening with Hazel, where like you grow up in this very sheltered world where you have a lot of resources, you develop your brain, and then you're like, I will go out in the world and I can figure this out and I'll fix things. And then you're like, oh, this is kind of more complicated than I thought.
That's it exactly. I mean, Hazel is more academic than Cher. Cher would not be caught dead with the scalpel. Hazel does not care about her clothes or appearance. It's like they have very, very different interests. But in terms of their like backgrounds and in terms of like exactly what you said, like I can figure out how to make this world better and I'm going to go out and do it. And then learning that like your little bubble doesn't necessarily extend as far as you thought it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of what I was trying to channel.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of the experience of going out and meeting the world for the first time, I feel like is what this is. And there's, I mean, I've seen also kind of in people reviewing it commenting like, the central love story seems to be between Hazel and training to be a doctor.
That is something I very much did intentionally. I think like the fact that it was called like Anatomy, a Love Story was sort of the wink in that direction. And I think like it was a balancing act of like not wanting to fall into the trap of this being the type of book where it's like an ambitious girl like meets a boy and that's it. Like it's like a Hallmark movie where it's
right.
Like, she's a busy businesswoman and now she runs a Christmas tree farm with her, towny boyfriend. I didn't want this to be a book about like a girl giving up her passions because she falls in love with a boy. But I also didn't want to fall into that trap of like girls who are smart aren't allowed to be interested in boys for some reason. Like no, like all girls teenage girls can notice if a guy is cute. I would notice if a guy is cute. Mm-hmm. Teenage girls can like have crushes and relationships and you can have both. And so I wanted her to have both, but not at the expense of the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, there's something to me, like I always love a love story where two people or specifically a man and a woman or a boy and a girl are brought together, and the attraction for the guy partly is like, I love your passion and I love that you want to do what you want to do and I want to help you do that by, breaking the law sometimes.
Yeah, I wanted him to be a manic pixie dream boy a little bit for girls. Just like, don't we deserve just like a guy who shows up to help you achieve your dreams for once?
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, this is like a much grislier approach to I think, the very winning Hallmark Christmas movie formula, where there's just a guy who's like, I do not need you to take care of me. I am going to take care of you and give you a mug of hot chocolate every 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, if Jack had brought her a mug of hot chocolate, I don't think that would have been amiss. I think that would have been very nice.
And then, I mean, something about I'm curious about whether Edinburgh was a setting that you chose, or whether it was like, if I'm writing about grave robbing in this time, I just have to do it in Edinburgh.
A bit of both. I will
Hmm.
actually say that the earliest draft of my book was a fictional place.
Hmm.
I was like, I didn't want it to be London. I didn't want it to be Boston. I didn't want it to be Edinburgh. And so I sort of like had it in America in a place that just didn't exist.
Hmm.
And I think very quickly I realized that like it was a stronger book with a grounded sense of place. And Edinburgh is the place to do that. I mean, that it's where grave robbing was happening. It was the
Hmm.
heart of the Enlightenment in terms of medical discoveries. And it was like where all of the surgeons that Hazel is sort of inspired and based on learned and studied and lived.
Hmm. I feel like the Age of Enlightenment is such an interesting time, and I feel like I wonder if it felt at all like it is to live today, where there's so much chaos, everything's falling apart, but like a bunch of white guys in their 20s are like, no, 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 we figured it out. Just like give us some money and we'll solve, the world.
Isn't it wild to think that they had solved everything? And if we had maybe stopped there, some things would have been better. But this idea that like we solved it, now we understand science. It's done. Check. It must have been really comforting to
Yeah.
think that you sort of reached the end. Also, do you ever I sometimes used to get sad when I would like look up people from like the 1700s and it would be like so and so is a mathematician and a botanist and an author and a philosopher, and these people got famous because they were able just to like identify a tree. And I'm like, nowadays, and you're like, oh, you're an inventor because you made like, a coffee filter. And nowadays, to be an inventor, you have to like understand computers. Like, I
Hmm.
could have been an inventor in the 1700s.
Right. You
I
could have been
understand
like, look at that
pulleys.
toad. It's a
Yeah.
yellow spotted toad.
And now you're an acclaimed naturalist.
I think, yeah, I don't know. There's something that feels, yeah, that feels far away. And I wonder if maybe art is kind of the way to access that now. Because now you can still find things, and you can still invent things, and you can have characters that can do that. I mean, was it like, so I know you pitched this before the pandemic, but then in terms of the writing and kind of the time that you were in the book, I'm curious about like timing wise, when was that? And also, uh, was it comforting? Like, was this a time and a place that it felt good to return to when we were dealing with all of this?
Yeah, I will say the biggest privilege of this book, I mean, aside from the privilege of like getting to write it, but like the fact that I pitched it before the pandemic, but then my like writing time was during the pandemic sort of, so I felt very lucky to have a job that wasn't impacted
Mm-hmm.
by, not being able to leave my house.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt very fortunate about that. I think it was comforting in the sense that I had something to do, and otherwise I would have driven myself crazy and everyone around me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm someone who like if I don't have like three things going on at once, I don't know how to function.
Yeah, one for each hand and one foot, ideally.
Yeah, that's it exactly.
And then, so this is really cool. And for people who are just joining, we're talking about Anatomy: A Love Story, the best cover of 2022. But you're doing a walking tour about Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley in April.
Yeah, I am like beyond excited. This was originally something that was going to happen in 2020, but then of course something happened in March 2020. So now finally we're doing it in 2022, and I just get to like talk to people about Mary Shelley and her mom, Mary Wollstonecraft, and the history of science fiction. And obviously, Frankenstein inspired so much of this book that, like, I'm very excited to do that. Oh, before we go, because we've been told like not to keep this going too long for attention spans, book recommendations. I wanted to recommend, I just finished two like amazing can't put down books, and I was kind of late to both of them. The first one was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which was just really good and compelling. And like, I know I was late too because everyone else had already jumped on board, but I loved it. And then I also loved Olga Dies Dreaming, which I thought was just like a really smart, like thoughtful look at capitalism and gentrification and immigrant communities in New York. Sarah, are you reading anything good?
Boy, I'm actually rereading Bridget Jones's Diary.
I've never read it.
White hot recommendation. It's great. I read it for some reason for the first time when I was like 11, and so it's funny to come back to it and remember that like this was how I was imagining that my 30s were going to be, and now they are basically like it's very, I don't know, it's very funny. I think the kind of the Jane Austen bones of it, the Pride and Prejudice kind of format, is more, you can like feel it in the writing in a really lovely way. And in terms of newer stuff, God, I just read this book called Anatomy of Love Story that I really like. Yeah, what have I been reading? It's hard to say.
Bridget Jones, I will say, I rewatched the movie recently, and how many jokes they make about her being overweight and having a huge butt, and then she's like 135 pounds, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. It's funny. I was so attached to the book when I was a tween that the movies kind of seemed separate. And I never quite did, but yeah. And it feels, I would say that the book is like, it's very steeped in the diet culture of 20 years ago, which was like much less self-aware than it is now. But I think there's something different, for me at least, about not having an actual seeable person who is, looks great, as we all do, being the target of that for an hour and a half.
I want to read the book. I always did love the movie, and so now I'm curious to go back. That's a great rec.
Before we wrap up, this is a question that it was suggested to me to ask, which I think is fantastic. If your book were a cocktail, what kind would it be?
Ooh, a gin fizz.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I feel like gin, it would have to be gin for the period, right?
And for the Edinburgh. I feel like Edinburgh gin is like a good I was going to say an old fashioned, and I don't know whether I meant that as a joke or not as I said it. But yeah, like a gin drink.
Yeah.
What's your cocktail of choice? That's another question before we go.
Well, it's funny you said that. Actually, it is an old fashioned. I like a brandy old fashioned. Yeah.
Ooh. Okay, well now I have two recommendations. I'm going to try Bridget Jones's Diary and a brandy old fashioned.
Those would go well together. And last question. I feel like, I don't know, this, like, here you are, like, here I am. We're so lucky. Like, we get to have these careers where we get to think about things that we are interested in and research and release podcasts and write books and write stories. And for someone who wants to do that and is kind of at the beginning of that journey, like, what would you say to that person?
Be patient. Unfortunately, this is an industry that, like, sometimes it happens immediately and sometimes it takes a little while, but that's not necessarily contingent on your ability or your talent or whether or not you're going to succeed. And so many brilliant creators like have to have other jobs at any point during their career. So be patient. And also don't forget to have fun. Like, never lose sight of the fact that, like, this is advice for me that I remind myself every day, that it's like being creative is a job, but there also needs to be an element of fun to it. And so don't forget. And if you're not having fun, readers probably won't either.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. I think, it can't be fun every day, all the time. But like if a
Yeah.
project, if it isn't fun for you, then yeah, people can feel that. And also why bother? Because we're all gonna die.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, it's a job. You can't complete anything and hope that it's going to be fun the whole time. Before we sign off, I'm going to do a little Beetlejuice cameo. Oh, he ran away.
Yay!
All right, well, that's a sign because he's not going to come and say hi.
But
He's very shy.
but he has an analog in this book too, so people get to
He
experience him
does.
there.
He has a little analog in this book. Sarah, thank you so much
Thank
for
you so much,
muddling
Jana.
through my first TikTok live experience.
Thank you so much for muddling through my next TikTok live experience, and thank you for everybody who was patient and came, and this was fantastic. And the next time we will do this via quill pen and parchment
Yeah,
for ease of
absolutely. Perfect.
communication. Yeah.
The way that we always do. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, everybody. Everybody go read Anatomy of Love Story.